If you want to learn how to build web applications using ASP.NET MVC, you have found the perfect video, my friend. So here you will learn how to create the Spend Smart web application from scratch. It will simply track your expenses. So here on the left side, you can see the application. You're able to add new expenses, right? So it's a pretty comprehensive application already. Let's click on Create New. We can simply write down the amount of your expense and then any kind of description. Let's say we want to add the rent here, then let's hit OK. Now you can see your list and your total expenses right here, and you're able to change the value of specific things. We're using an in-memory database with Entity Framework underneath the hood. And for sure, we can also delete things and everything gets updated. So please join me, because during the next hour, you will learn how to build this nice web application using ASP.NET MVC entirely from scratch. I know that you are thrilled to get started. Before we dive right in, please allow me to present you our all-access membership, including special live elements. So we run a developer membership, right? You can become a member here at Tutorials.eu, and you will get access to all of our coding courses. And in addition to that, you will get access to all of our live elements. Those include the live coding workshops, live Q&A sessions, and this one is really special, one-on-one programmer mentorship calls where you can connect to a software developer mentor which helps you achieve your goals. No matter if this means you want to land a developer job, or you're just starting out learning to code, or you want to build a software and you're facing problems or don't know where to start, you can connect to your developer mentor and get perfect individual and high quality guidance and support. You will not find any other subscription that is offering what we are offering, so make sure to check out the link in the description below or in the top right corner now. This is definitely the best place to be as an aspiring developer, so I hope to see you in there. Great, so now let's get started by creating a brand new project from scratch. So here I got Visual Studio 2022 as of right now, and I want to create a new project. And now please pay attention, because when you create a project, you have to make sure that you pick the correct template. So let's write down ASP.NET and then MVC for Model View Controller. Right here we got ASP.NET Core Web App Model View Controller. That's exactly the one that we want to pick. Great, so in future this name might change. However, you want to make sure that you pick the one which says Model View Controller, right? And it's written in C# and ASP.NET Core Web App. That's perfect. So pay attention on that, because if you pick the wrong template, you have to create a new, project later on. So make sure that it's just like this one. Great, so let's hit next. We'll call it Spend Smart because we want to track expenses, right? Spend Smart. Can save it anywhere. Let's hit next. And now again, pay attention, we want to use .NET 8, and if you want to follow along with this video, please make sure that you also pick .NET 8. It's in long-term support as of right now. We don't want to have any authentication, we don't want to enable Docker, and we also don't want to use the top-level statements, so tick that checkbox. Great. Now let's hit create then. Once a project got created, you should see a screen similar looking like this. If it doesn't look like this, go to Window, and then simply go to reset window layout, and that way you'll be able to follow along. Great. So let's just start our application and see what we come up with. Now you can click on the debug button, so on the play button here at the top of the screen. Just give it a second to load, and now our application will start up and open up a new browser window, and you can see our application here. Or if you want to start the application without starting the debugging mode, you can simply hit Ctrl F5, and this is definitely what I do recommend while we are not actively debugging. It will open up a new browser window too. Here we go. Great, so this is our web application, and you can see that it is running at our local machine, which is called localhost, right? And then we have a specific port here. For me now it's 7267. For you it might be a different one. Now our web application looks like a website, right? Here we have a home page, we can click on that, and then we have a privacy page here. And this is called the internal routing, right? So we can change all of those later on. We'll make use of it once we talk about model, views, and controllers. So that's it for now. Let's just take a look here at our project. We have picked the MVC template. MVC Model View Controller means that we are using a pattern which is using controllers to actually, route the user to specific pages, the views. And what we show inside of those views are often the so-called models or our data objects, in easy words. So this is why we have a folder here called controllers, we have a folder called models, and we have a folder called views. And when we start our application, we can see our home page or the index page. And this is because inside of the home controller, which is the only controller as of right now, we have a so-called iActionResult method here, which is called index. And once we go to that endpoint by starting the application, it's the default one, he will search for a view with the same name as the index method here, so an index view. And as you can see, inside of the views folder on the right side, we have the home folder, which is directly connected to the home controller. It's connected by a pattern where the names are getting matched. And there we have the index CSHTML view. This is CSHTML, so we got a lot of HTML. And then we have C# inside here, indicated by the @ sign and the curly braces. Great, so here we got the welcome. And again, if we start the application, you can see that welcome right here. Now, if I change that, say hi there, for example, I will just remove that in a second again. And if I save it and simply hit Ctrl F5 again, it will restart or recompile the application. You can now see hi there. So the views, as I said, those CSHTML files, they contain the actual content that the user can see and interact with. Great, so now we gotta change it back to welcome here, save it like this. Cool. Next up, we want to create our own model. We want to track expenses, right? And an expense contains a value and a description at least. So inside of our models folder, let's simply right click, let's hit add, and let's add a new class. And you will learn the MVC pattern in this video simply by applying what I'm teaching, right? So while we build this application, you will learn how to use the MVC pattern and what exactly it means. So our first model, we'll call it expense. Not expenses, but expense. Let's hit add. And as I said, we should now think about the properties. Now, later on, we will store these classes, our models, inside of a database, right? Think of a NoSQL database or maybe an SQL database or whatsoever, but whatever we put into our database, those are the models. So let's add a property here, which is called int ID. For an SQL database, for instance, we will need a so-called primary key so that every item in our database has a unique ID, which we can use to get the item. Then an expense will have any kind of value. Let's say I went to the grocery store and spent $100, right? So I spent $100. Let's create another property for a decimal, and we will call it value. This will be in the end the price, something like that. And we will have another property, write down prop, hit tab, and then we will put that in a string, and it will be the description. So description, you can see here, is not nullable. We want to make it nullable, so we can do it just like that. Add a question mark here. Now we can have a null value for this property. However, don't care about that too much. We want to have a description in any kind of way, so we can add a so-called data annotation and set it to required. In that way, we have to enter a value for the description. It's not optional, we have to enter a value, right? For the value here itself, which is our price in the end, we have a default value in any kind of way, which is 0, right? So we could track 0 expenses whatsoever, but it could be possible. Great. Now we have completed our model. Let's just forget about that for now. When we go to our application right here, we should have a page which displays all of our expenses, right? Just think of that from a user experience side of view. If I'm a user and I want to go to my Spend Smart application, I want to see all of my expenses. So what we need is a view. We need a new view that displays all expenses. Let's create a view. Let's start with a simple one. So here we got our views folder on the right side. And as I said, right now for this application, we will only have one controller, the home controller. So let's just stick with it. Inside of the home controller, right click and hit add. So right click on the home controller, right? And then add, and let's add a new view. It's at the very top, it says view. We take a razor view empty, that's fine. And again here, razor view empty, and let's give it a name. And we want to call it expenses. Let's hit add. This will create a new CSHTML file. Now go to the index.html and simply copy what's here at the very top. This is basically just setting the title for what you can see here, homepage, right at the top. We can say we want to change it to expenses. Now again, go to the index.html and simply copy over that HTML part here. And let's, instead of writing welcome, let's say expenses, just to make sure that we can see when we get there. And let's remove the paragraph here, just like that. Great. So now if we go to our application, let's hit Ctrl F5. The question is like, how do we get to our new view, right? We can click on home, we can click on privacy. Well, how do we get to our new page? We can also not simply write down expenses here, right? It's not working. It's not spelled right, but it's still not working if it would be spelled right. Expenses, that's not working. So how exactly does routing work? Well, if we take a look here, scroll down into program.cs, this is where our entire application gets configured. We are creating services, we are adding, well, new services on the fly, and so much more, having authorization, etc. We have a specific method call here, which is called map controller route. And here we have a pattern, and the pattern to get to a specific view or to call a specific action is writing down the controller name, which is the default one, home for now, we only have one, and then writing down the action name. And an action, as I said, if we go to the controller, is what we got right here. So simply the name of the method in that case. So how do we get to our new page now, to our new view page? Well, we have to create a new iActionResult method. So let's write down public iActionResult, and our view is called expenses. Take a look at the right side here, expenses, right? And this is why we also call the method expenses. Exactly the same name, so that the matching, the pattern matching is actually working. So let's just return view. Return view basically says that he will return the view with exactly the same name as the method, so expenses. Let's go to our application. We can start the debug mode, don't have to, as I said already. And now we can go to /home, that was the pattern, and then the name of the action, which is expenses. Let's hit enter, and you can now see that we are here at expenses. Great. So that said, let's take a look at our start page, again at our home page. Here we can see home and privacy, so we should now really adjust the nav bar so that we add our expenses to easily navigate to that. And then also we will change the part right here to add something, maybe a button where we say go to expenses or overview or whatsoever. So that's done easily. Let's go to our shared folder here. And inside the shared folder, we have the so-called layout. And inside of this layout, when you scroll down, you can see that we have nav items here, right? We have home and then privacy right here. How are we routing that? Well, you can see two calls here, which is ASP controller and ASP action. So you basically say is whenever you click on that A tag, which is a link, we want to invoke the home controller, and inside of the home controller, we want to invoke the index action, which is then obviously just showing the index view. So let's copy over that nav item. We'll just zoom out a bit so that you can see everything here. I will just take that li and duplicate it, put it in between, and I will change the name to expenses, right? And now I will zoom in again. So expenses. And again, we are in the home controller, but we will have to invoke a different action. So don't invoke the index action, instead invoke the expenses action. Again, I want to show it, it's here. This one will get called, which will then render the view with the same name, expenses. So Ctrl F5, let's take a look at our application. And you can now see that we have the expenses nav item here. We can click on that and we'll go there. Now, this is how you add something to your navbar. And now I want to go to the index page right here, which says welcome. And I want to remove that P here and I want to add a button instead, or I want to add an A tag instead. So for the A tag, let's simply say overview, right? And in addition, I want to add a class to style it like a button. So right here in this template, we're using Bootstrap, which is a CSS framework for styling. So I will now apply some simple Bootstrap classes. BTN turns like applies some button styling, and BTN-primary makes that button look blue. Great. In addition to that, and that's now very important, if we would click on that link, nothing would happen because we have not attached any URLs, something like that, right? So again, we want to say that what we want to invoke is an ASP action equals to expenses. So again, we want to say expenses, there we go, that we want to go to the home controller. And now pay attention, I don't have to say ASP controller. I can do that, ASP controller equals to home. I can do it that way. I don't have to do it because our view right here, this index view, is already inside of the home folder, which indicates that we want to communicate with the home controller. Okay, so we can leave it like this, but we don't have to. However, we want to say, whenever I want to click on that A tag or someone clicks on that A tag, we want to go into the home controller and invoke the expenses action, which will then render the expenses view. Again, controller 5, take a look at the application. There we go. You can now see that we have an overview button right here. If I click on that, I will go to the expenses view. Brilliant. So that's the very first part, which is, well, based on how to route the user, how to add views, and how to actually move inside of your application. Now we will move on to the next part where we create the functionality to actually create new expenses and edit existing ones. Because right here we want to show an overview of all expenses, but we do not have any so far, right? So now let's move on and let's get to the point where we are able to create expenses. And in order to achieve this, we have to add a new view again. So right click again on your home folder, add a new view, take that view here, and let's call it create edit expense. This indicates that inside of this view, we are able to create a new expense or to edit an existing one. So let's hit add. Let's remove this again. Go to the index.html, copy over everything, just paste it back in. Here we don't want to say homepage, we want to say create / edit, for example. We want to say create or edit an expense. And then we want to remove the A tag here, just like that. Now, let's go again to our home controller. It's not here anymore because I have too many tabs open. I will just reduce the size here, home controller, and we will now create again a new iAction result. So I want to copy that, public iAction result, and I want to say that this is called create edit expense, exactly the same name as the view. Save it like this, and then go to the index.html, and right here we want to duplicate that, paste it back in, ASP controller, home, and now create edit expense. We want to add a second button, right? And then it's not btn primary, it's a secondary, which will create a gray button, btn secondary. Let's say create new. Save it like this, hit Ctrl F5, and take a look at the changes that we have inside of our application now. So go to the home page. You can see overview, which brings us to expenses. And we have create new, which brings us to our new page, create or edit an expense. So next up, we have to create a form here where we can fill out, well, the information for a new expense. Let's move on. Go to the create edit expense here. Right below that div, we want to create a form. And let's think about what information we have to put in here. First of all, we have to make sure that we tell our view what we want to create. We want to create an expense field. So let's say add model, and then write down the actual path. So we have our model right here, expense. Yes, you can see it's in Spend Smart Models, right? That's the path. So let's write down in our create edit expense, spend smart.models.expense. Now for this view, we have now configured the expense as the model that we are talking about. So let's go into our form and now create 3 input fields. We have an ID, we have a value, and we have a description, right? So let's write down a label. Let's say ID. Let's duplicate this 3 times. Say value in dollars and say description. And now we need something to fill out, and this is why we add an input field. And we want to apply some styling, so write down class form-control CSS for Bootstrap, right? and we want to set a type. The type for the ID is a number. And we also want to add a placeholder, which could be like 0, for example. And then finally, and that's very important, we have to say this input field here, this one is for the ID. And we are doing this with the keyword ASP-4. ASP4, and now we can simply say ID. And why do he know those properties? Well, that's because we have configured the expense class here as the model for this view. So he knows ID, he knows description, and so on. Let's copy that over, do it for the value now. So again, it's type number. Placeholder could be like, for example, 0, and ASP4 would be value. Let's add another thing here, which is step, so that we can increase and decrease the value by 0.01. That will be 1 penny, 1 cent, wherever you come from. And then finally, another input field, form control, type is text because it's a description, placeholder, add a description, right? And the value, or ASP4, we want to connect it to the description property. We do not have a step right here. Great, so it should look like this for you now. You can pause the video and just double check that it looks exactly like this. Great. Finally, we want to submit the form, right? So we need a button. In that case, let's add a button here. We can also add an A tag, doesn't really matter. Again, let's add a class here. It's btn-primary. And the only thing that we have to do is to make this the submit button. Type submit. Because a button with the type set to submit submits the actual form where the button is inside. Great. So let's simply write down OK. And in order to add some vertical spacing, I want to add an MRT4, margin top 4, to every label. So, but not the first one, sorry. It's for this one here, class MT4, and for this one too, class MT4, and also for the button, so that we have some vertical space. Now that brings up a question. When we submit this form, where do we send this information to, right? We can now see the form. When I hit Ctrl F5, you will see that just in a second. And we set up the form, you can see it right here, but we have not configured what should happen when we click on OK, right? So we can send the form to an action, and therefore we have to go to the home controller again and create another action, public, action result, and let's say create edit expense form. Just an example for the naming. You can name it differently if you would like to, but this really makes sure that we are sending it to this endpoint right here. It's not the best name to pick, I'm brutally honest, but this is just making it obvious for you. And now again we want to return, but this time, very important, when we go to this action here, create edit expense, we are seeing that page. Alrighty. Now we want to send the form to this one right here, to this endpoint, and afterwards, after we have created or edited something, we want to get redirected to the index page to then see the changes and all of the expenses that we've created. So let's write down return, redirect to action, and the action we want to redirect to is index. So by calling redirect to action, we will in the end then call this method here, which will then render the index view. Alrighty. Again, our form here that we have is bound to the model expense. Alright. So in the end, this form submits a model or an object of type expense. So inside of our form call here, we will receive as a parameter our expense. We can call it model, right? So we have an object of type expense here, and this is the one that we can then save to a database. This is basically the next step. Now before we see this in action, let's go to our create edit expense here again. And now let's say that this form should get sent to ASP action, and now put in the name. You can copy it, no worries, but make sure that you're sending it to the form one. Right, and you can also configure the ASP controller again, which is the home controller. This is where this action is actually implemented. Now go to our home controller and set a breakpoint here in line 32 for me, where we are actually, well, right before we're returning, so that we can check if the model here has some values inside. So hit the green play button to start the debugger mode. Let's just give it a second to load. In the end, you will see the page here. Let's create something new. Let's write down an ID 1, for example, a value $100, and let's write down Netflix, a bit pricey, but doesn't matter too much. Let's hit OK. That should stop the breakpoint. Hover above model, you can unfold this and you should now see all of those values. Netflix, ID is set to 1, value is 100, that worked perfectly fine. And when we continue in that application, we are getting redirected to the index page. Alrighty? Great, so that's fine for now, except one thing. We have to make sure that we are not getting redirected to the index page, but to the expenses page. So write down expenses, because in the end we want to, after creating or editing something, we want to go back to see all the expenses. Great, so that's it for the second part. And now you might ask yourself, all right, but why can I not see this expense? Well, we are not saving it to any database. So we are basically just getting the information from the form and they will just redirect it into another page, right? But we are not storing the information of our expense in a database, and therefore we are not able to show it inside of a table, for example. So our next step would now be to create a database. Well, and this one is a little bit more complicated, but no worries, I will break it down for you to make it easy to understand. Now pay attention, it doesn't really matter if you're doing that for SQL or for in-memory database or for a NoSQL database. The procedure is basically always the same. We are using Entity Framework, right, in order to save data. And therefore we have to install two new tools now. So go to Tools, go to NuGet Package Manager, go to Manage NuGet Packages for Solution, and now we have to install two things. On the left side, click on Browse, that's very important, click on Browse, right? And write down in-memory, let's hit Enter, and you can see Microsoft Entity Framework Core and Memory. This is an in-memory database, so we don't have to set up an SQL database and a server instance and all of that. We're just storing the information of the data that we are creating in our application inside of the RAM, right? So inside of our computer's memory. Let's hit Install, that's the first one, so that we get access to the in-memory database. And secondly, we have to install Entity Framework. Click on that and then pick the core one. You can see it should match your .NET version, right? It's 8. Microsoft Entity Framework Core, selected, and then hit Install again. And this will install Microsoft Entity Framework Core. Let's hit Install. Give it a second to load. And then we are ready to go. Great. Let me just close that. In Entity Framework, we use the so-called database context. And that's the next thing that we have to create now. So let's go to the models folder. You can put it also in a folder called data or whatsoever, but I want to put it in the models folder. We already have enough folders that might confuse you, so I want to keep it simple. Now right click on that one, hit add, and then add a new class, and we will call it expenses DB context. All right, expenses DB context. Let's call it spend smart DB context. All right, so let's hit add. And now make sure that you inherit this, and that's very, very, very important, from the original DB context class. Okay, DB context, go. It will now not work, but if I hover above that and show the potential fixes, you can see that once we add the using directive here of Entity Framework Core, he knows the DB context class and it's working fine now. That's the first part. Now, secondly, now actively think about any kind of database. What do we want to store inside that database? Think of tables. We want to store our expenses. So let's add a so-called DB set of type. This is just like a table, right? DB set created table for our expenses model. And this basically means that he will create columns for ID, for value, and for description. Call it expenses, totally fine. I want to write it in uppercase, expenses. And I want to do it as a property, in fact, so I want to say public DB set expenses, and then we want to do it like a get set. I'm sorry for that, it's not a variable, it is a property, of course. So write it down like public DB set expenses, our expense, and then call it expenses. Now that's it almost, but here's one thing that we have to do to make Entity Framework Core working. We have to write down a constructor, so write down ctor, hit tab. And now inside of that constructor, please provide the DB context options, and want to create it for the spend smart DB context. Simply call it options. You can leave everything empty here. This is just what we have to do to make it working. And now very important again, use the base constructor and provide the options. If you're not doing that, you will receive an error which tells you to do so, to use it to make everything working underneath. Right, now finally, let me fix the typo here. So I want to go to expenses. Great, expenses. Now we set up our database context, and inside here, we will save all of our information. We will use that database context to save things in our database, to load things from our database, and so on. So let me just close that for now. We don't need it anymore. Now finally, we have to configure it. And as I said earlier, in the program.cs, we can configure our entire application. So go to the program.cs, and here at the very top where you can see add services to the container. So right here, let's write down builder.services.add DB context. We want to add a DB context and we want to use our new one. So write down spend smart DB context, right? Here we got the call, just like that, add DB context. And now inside here, we have the options, right, for the constructor. This is why we have created the constructor just in the previous step. We want to say inside of the options, we want to use options.use in-memory database. Here's the plugin or the tool that we've just installed, right? And we want to call that database, let's say spend smart DB. That's just how it's named inside of our computer's memory then. So it should look like this. Again, feel free to pause the video now and make sure that it looks exactly like this. Great. Now we have configured our in-memory database. And this brings up the question on how can we now go to the home controller right here. Here we got our model, right here we receive the form. And how can we save this expense model, so that information now, to the database? And that's done fairly simple via so-called dependency injection. So let's create at the very top inside of our home controller a new property, read only. We want to call it spend smart DB context, write down context with underscore. It's just typically done in that way. And then, well, we can use autocomplete here, spend smart DB context, use it inside of the constructor because it will get injected into the instance of this controller when the application basically starts or the home controller gets requested or created, right? And then we set the value here. So make sure that you've added this one here, right? So as a parameter inside of the constructor and then the context. And as I said, the instance that we receive right here in the constructor is well handled or gets injected by the so-called dependency injection system, which is implemented in ASP.NET under the hood. Great. So we can use the context, so that one here, to actually, well, save things to our database. Remove things, change things, and so on. So as I said, here you want to create something, right? The model. And in that way, we can now actually simply take our context, so our database. If I say context, always think of the database, right? And we want to go to our table, expenses, and we want to add something there. We want to add the model because the model is of type expense and fits into the expenses table. And now, very important, please do never forget that when you adjust the database, if you change something, remove something, or just add something, we always have to change those changes. Right? Simply calling add is not enough. You have to go to the database and save the changes to actually apply what you have just modified. No matter if you add something, change, or remove something. Great. Now hit save again. It will work under the hood now, but when we go to the expenses, we will get redirected to this one. We will still not be able to see anything here because we have not set up something, right? And this is why we now want to create a table that displays all of the information of the expenses that we are basically saving, right? However, we want to make sure that everything is working fine, so simply set a breakpoint here right before return something, just to make sure that saving the database or saving in the database and the configuration is set up properly. So start the application. Once that's done, it will take a second to load here. There we go. Let's create something new, set the ID to 1, value 100, description Netflix or whatever, hit OK. You can see it worked fine, right? We were able to get to the breakpoint, so all of this did not cause any errors, so it worked fine, and we will see the result just after completing the next step. But our database is working properly, that's the important part now. Cool. That said, let's go to our expenses CSHTML. Or before we do that, let's simply scroll up and go to the iAction result expenses. Now again, inside of this view, we want to show all of our expenses that we have created, right? So therefore, we have to go into the view and submit some stuff here, right? We now have set up a context. So we can go to our database, to the context, and say var all expenses equals to context expenses dot to list. Very important. Write down to list or to array or whatsoever. If you're not doing that, you're just taking the query. You have to execute that query by writing down to list. So we go to the database, we go to the expenses table, we take all of the values and put them into a C# list, and then we take that list and put them into the view all expenses. Again, let me hover above that type. It's of type list expenses, right? List expenses. Now go to the view expenses HTML, and inside here we now want to show all the information. This is why we add the model here, and we want to say the model, the content that we want to show here is of type list expenses. So inside here we want to render a list basically, or expense, not expenses, right? Great. Now finally we can move on. Let's hit a BR here, a break, and now we use some razor syntax. So write down, first of all, basic HTML. We want to create a table, and in order to make it look a bit better, we want to add a class from Bootstrap which is simply called table, and then we have a T head. And as a sibling, we have a T body. This is just plain HTML, right? And inside of a T head, we can create a TR, a table row. And inside a TR, we can create a TH, a table header. And then we have ID. We are doing that for every property now. ID. Oh, there we go. And value. And in addition, description. And later on, we will add one more, but not now. Right, description, and inside of the T body we can create table rows too, and for every entry that we have, which could be dynamic, we could have 10 expenses or 100 or 1, we want to, well, render this based on the information of how many or what kind of expenses do we have here. So therefore we want to use razor syntax. Write down add curly braces, and now let's add a for each loop. For each tap var expense in our model. So write down model, in model, right? It's an uppercase, in model. And this is our list that we are sending into this view. For each of our expense in model, we want to create a TR, a table row. And inside that row, we want to have multiple table datas. And here we want to render add expense. Using the add sign, we can grab the value here from the expense from that C#.id. This is the first one. Right, the first table data belongs to the first column basically of our table, and then we duplicate the TD just 2 more times. Make sure that the TDs are inside of one TR. Should look like this, and then we have value and description. That's basically all we have to do to dynamically render all of the expenses that we are creating in our application. So let's hit Ctrl F5 to start our application. Let me just pull that over here. Let's go to overview. You can see we have a table here now. It's empty. Let's go to expenses, to home, sorry. Let's create a new. Let's hit the ID 1, value 100, description Netflix, for example. Now let's hit OK, and we get redirected to our expenses table. And you can see that this is working properly. Value 100, Netflix, and whatsoever. There are some more things to do now, because that one is pretty nice, right? And many tutorials would have stopped here already, but we're taking it to the next level. We should definitely be able to edit an existing expense if we made a mistake, and we should also be able to delete something. Everything here now is really fairly simple. You already have done the majority of what's needed for this application. We just have to add some smaller features now. And then finally, we will add the last feature to really show the total amount of all the expenses, the value, right? If we have let's say five expenses here, and each of those has a value of 100, we can say total expenses $500, right? Cool, so let's move on. We just bring that to the side here. Let's go to our table here, and let's add 2 actions. First of all, we add a new th, we call it actions. And then we go to a new td, and in this td we do not have any value like this. Instead we have 2 a tags. Okay, the first A tag will be class. Don't need a class here, I'm sorry. We need an ASP action. The first one will be the actual A tag or the link to edit. And the second one will be the one to delete. So let's just put them here. ASP action. This one, think about it again. We have created a view for creating and editing something, right? So go again to the home controller and take a look at create edit expense. This will bring up our view. Let's put it down here. Create edit expense. But if we are editing something, we have to know which item do you want to edit. And we have a unique ID here, not unique yet, but it will become unique just in a second, expense ID. We want to say that we provide the ASP root ID. Okay, in that way we can root anything. You don't have to use the ID here. You can pick whatever whatever property you want to root, but in almost any cases it's the ID because that's the unique identifier. So ASP root ID, and then we add an equal sign codes, and then add expense.id. There we go, expense.id. Alright, just like here, right? This basically means that we are getting to the ASP action and that we are submitting an ID there. But take a look here at the home controller. We are not receiving an ID. So let's take an int, which could be nullable, and name it ID. Why could it be nullable? Well, if we create something new, we will not have an ID. Only if we added an existing one, we will have an ID. So this is why this property could be null. Cool. For delete, we will have to add something new. We will have to add a new action. So let's write down delete expense. And same for this, we also have to take the ID here, ASP root ID equals to add expense.id, because again, the question is what kind of or which expense do you want to delete? Please go ahead and give me an ID so that I can go to the database and pick the expense that you want to delete from the database by using the ID, and then I will delete it. You always have to make sure that you ask yourself the same questions, right? Great. Now that this is done, we can go to our home controller again and create one more public iAction result, which we call delete. And inside here, we again provide an ID. Now, to be honest, this will not be null, so we don't have to make it nullable. We can remove it because if you want to delete something, you need an ID, right? For create or edit, it was the case that if we create something new, we do not have an ID. So after deleting something, we want to return redirect to view, right? To action, I'm sorry, expenses. So after deleting something, we just want to return the user to the overview page, which is called expenses. So let's start with the simple one, deleting, all right? We simply go ahead and go into our database and searching for an item, an expense with the ID like the one from the property, from the parameter. So let's say var expense in DB, expense in database equals to context expenses and then single or default. And this one we can also complete here. This is basically just like a simple link query, right? We're going to our expenses list or our table, and we take the first one that we find where the ID matches the one from the parameter here. X is basically the expense. We can also rename it to make it a bit more obvious. Expense goes to expense, 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 there we go, ID equals to ID. Maybe that's a bit easier to understand. But expense is like if we have 100 expenses every time one of them checking where the ID fits the ID from the parameter right here. In the end, he would just basically return the correct one that we need. So var expense and ID, and then we can take our context, go to the expenses again, and then simply call the remove method here and remove this entity. This is basically why it's called entity framework. Each element or entry inside of our database is called an entity. So remove that one, and as I said, if you modify anything, go ahead and save changes. That's the first part. All right, and now go ahead and copy the first line of code here, expense in ID, and put it into our create edit expense right here. Now we have a scenario here. If we have an ID, so if the ID is not null, then we are editing something, right? Editing, so load. We're loading an expense by ID, so we simply load that one again, like we did before. We go to the database and pick the one by ID, and then we simply return the view and put in the expense that we have just loaded. And it fits in here because the model inside of that view is also set to be an expense. That's what we did earlier. And if we do not have an ID, then we will simply return the view an empty one because we're creating something new. Great. Now we are almost done. There's one small, well, problem or thing that we have to fix. We will see that just in a second. But first of all, let's just try what we have done. So let's create something new here. Let's set the ID is 1, the value is 100, and the description, we can set that to be Netflix, for example. Let's hit OK. That's the first one. And let's just try to edit that. So we want to edit it and we want to set it to 200. And now pay attention, if we hit OK, you can see that it's not working. Why it isn't working? Because we already have an item with the ID set to 1. And that's the problem with Entity Framework or SQL databases in general. You cannot have two items with the same ID, right? And where's this problem coming from? Well, take a look here. We're just always adding something, but we have to make sure that we make a separation between I'm editing something and I'm adding something. So the fix for this is to make sure if the model has an ID. So if model.id equals to 0, if there is no ID, so no ID assigned, then we are actually creating something, right? So simply take that call here and put it inside here. Else, in every other case, we have an ID, so we are editing something. And in that way, we can say context.expenses.update. We can take the new model with our changes here and then update the existing entry. Great. Another thing, and that's very important, when we use Entity Framework in memory SQL or whatsoever, whenever we call the add here, Entity Framework itself will create automatically an incrementing primary key. So we do not have to do that manually. And this is why in many of the applications that you know, whenever you create something, you cannot see any kind of ID field, right? So let's go to our create edit expense view, and here you can see our ID, right? And we want to make that hidden. It's not visible anymore because Entity Framework will take care of everything related to the ID. Let's save it. Let's hit Ctrl F5, and now we will have a nice and sweet application with only one small feature left to create. It really just takes a couple of seconds to get that done. So let's move on. Before we take a look at our application, let's make sure that we rename this here because it's not delete. Take a look at our expenses. I called it delete expense. That's very important. I have to pick the correct name or we receive a 404. So delete expense, that's how I named it, right? And then we can now start our application, hit Ctrl F5. Now we can test around just a bit. And then the only thing that we have to add is the final last feature. So create new, let's say value set to 100, description is set to Netflix, for example. Let's hit OK. You can see that we have it right here. Let's hit delete, working fine. It's gone now. Go to home again. Let's create another one. Let's set it to 100 again. Let's say Netflix, right? Let's hit OK. Let's go. And you can see it's now ID 2, right? Even though the first one got removed, you will never see an item again with ID 1. This is basically how Entity Framework sets the primary keys. If there was an element or is an element with ID 1, there will never be another element with ID 1 again, created from scratch. Let's edit. Let's say Netflix was a bit cheaper this time, 25 bucks, for example. Let's hit OK. You can see the value got adjusted. It works fine. Let's create something new. Let's go to expenses or go to home, go to create new. Let's just write down grocery value. Sorry, let's say 75. Let's write down grocery. Let's hit OK. You can see we have another element here, value set to 75. Cool. Almost done. We just need to add the total amount of expenses, right? So let's just bring that aside and get the final thing done, which introduces the last feature for this tutorial, which is called the viewbag. So inside of our expenses, in our overview list, we want to show the total amount, right? So we have all expenses already. Let's say var total expenses equals to, we take our all expenses and then we sum everything, right? Each expense by X, where X goes to price, value, sorry. So we take all of the expenses and sum up the value. And then we take the so-called view bag. Just think of a bag that we put in or create inside of our controller, and we take it to the view. And inside of the view, we can access whatever is inside of that bag. View bag expenses equals to total expenses. Alrighty, total expenses. Great. Make sure it's not all expenses. It should be total expenses. That should be the total cost. We could also call it total cost or whatsoever. Save it and go to the expenses CSHTML here. Now create at the very top part here, let's create a BR and then an HR to add a nice line, a BR again to add some spacing, right? And in between all of those, we want to add an H3. And the H3 says total expenses is dollars, and then we want to add the viewbag dot, and now the name, make sure that it's written exactly like you did right here, expenses, because you can name it however you want to do it, right? It's just have to make sure it's the string basically, which is like a valid viewbag and then expenses, and it will take the value from the viewbag. So if we save it like this and we hit Ctrl F5 to start the application, you can see total expenses is 0. Let's go to home. Let's create something new. Let's say value is, let's take something more crazy, 1575. Let's say Netflix. Let's hit OK. There we go, 1575. You can see that right here. And let's go to home again, create something new again. Let's take the value, which could be 625. And let's say grocery, right? And then go to OK. And you can now see this summed up to $22. Brilliant. And now you have an already pretty much comprehensive application built in something like 1 hour or what, right? And yeah, you can create new entities. You can save them inside of an in-memory database. You can edit them, you can delete them. You know what different views are. We are routing the user. We are routing information, if it's IDs or if it's entire models. You can use the viewbag to, well, calculate things inside of controllers and then send them to the front end, just like we did here. Now we have reached the end of this tutorial, but don't be sad, there is so much more to discover on our channel. Or if you're really serious about becoming a programmer and learning how to code, make sure to check out our all access membership, the ultimate membership for aspiring coders, right, where you get access to all of our high quality and top-notch coding courses, and in addition you can access all of our live elements, which include live coding sessions, Q&A sessions, and one-on-one programmer mentorship calls. We help you get to the next level, no matter if that means learning a specific framework, building a specific application, or help you land a developer job. So make sure to check this out, link is in the description, and I hope to see you back in one of our upcoming videos. So cheers!